As ever, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think I can say that I was involved with CRIMT in its early days, indeed even before CRIMT existed at all, and it's fantastic to see it flourishing and growing and developing in the way that it has. It's a fabulous achievement. Now, I've been given, in some sense, the boring and the old-fashioned task of talking about what we used to call industrial relations and what an agenda in that area might look like. The question mark at the end of the title indicates the theme, which is that it's very dangerous to predict the future. It's extremely hazardous trying to do these things, but at least we can ask some better questions. So the employment relationship, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to treat as being relations at the point of production, together with the institutions that regulate those relations. Historically, of course, collective bargaining, shaped by the ways in which the state intervened to set employment conditions through the law or indirectly. So if you think back to classic works of the past, the idea was, in Keith Sisson's famous phrase, that these institutions were there to neutralize the workplace, to take away the conflicts and tensions that arise in the employment relationship, package them up and neutralize them in some kind of way. So if we look into the future, we would be looking at what happened to collective bargaining. Now, I'm going to give you one illustration of the dangers of futurology. I've chosen them for several reasons. Firstly, they come from a very seasoned observer. His name is Fred Emery, well-known commentator of the period. Secondly, there were comments at a conference to explore, it says, to explore the future courses of a continuous engagement of the social sciences with the important practical affairs of mankind. I guess we're doing that here, aren't we? It also happened 30 years ago, which is a convenient benchmark, and it happened in Canada. The difference is that conference took place in the stultifying atmosphere of Ontario, whereas we have the clear and rarefied conditions of La Belle Provence. So, that's what Fred Emery said, and it's fairly evident he got it pretty wrong. And he got it wrong for two reasons. Firstly, he was identifying one causal factor and leading to a result, neglecting the many other factors involved, and he was moving from the macro to the micro in far too ready and simple a way. I don't think anybody would now be suggesting that the employment relationship had moved to be a salaried relation. So, what can we do about that? Well, it's easy to come up with a list of things towards a better answer. I've listed a few things there. You could add your own preferences. Aging workforce might be one. I just want to say something, however, about the point about methodology. There are many studies nowadays which talk about intersectionality, multiple processes at work, identity formation and all the rest of it, and trying to understand the complexities of social relations at work. But when you get to the methods that those studies use, they often rely on one-off interviews, and they don't get down to the detail that we need to have. So it's important looking forward to think of a methodology which gets us beyond that. If we're interested in, as Gregor was talking about, social capital, we need to understand that in a much more complex, dynamic, long-term way than is possible through simple one-off interviews. And if we keep relying on that method, we promise more than we deliver. So the limits to the easy answer. How do we know that what we think is important today will be important now and in the future? In the past, we would have said the future agenda is understanding how collective bargaining is maturing and generalizing. And we know that such an agenda has turned out to be entirely inappropriate. Secondly, I don't know how many of us have used this phrase how often, the indeterminacy of the labour contract. It's a core element of what we as employment relations talk about. And if we insist on that, we have to say that things are indeterminate, therefore we can't know what's going to happen in them, can we? And finally, of course, the shifting context of three types of market. And of course, changes also in the ways in which they're regulated at different levels. So those are the limits. What can we do about it? Well, a better kind of answer I'm going to try to provide is methodological and not substantive. And we're going to go through these four bullet points in order. So firstly, this is all fairly obvious, this bit. Various forces which you might say are weakening labour. What are the external causal factors which are impinging on the employment relationship at the point of production? Forces in the labour market, they include the individualisation of the employment contract, and also, notably, growing requirements of some firms on workers to provide their own skills and training. I have a colleague at Birmingham who's been looking at Ryanair, for example, which is notorious for saying, you provide and pay for your own training before we'll even look at employing you. And that's shifted an awful long way from the past. Then we have product markets, supply chain pressures, the ability of firms to set prices and all of that, and then growingly also, of course, finance markets, financialisation and parallel forces in the public sector. There are, of course, counter-tendencies constraining capital, the obvious need for skill and consent at the workplace, consumer forces, social responsibility, moves, for example, to reshore offshored call centres and other non-labour actors. And the final thing to mention on this slide is regulation and legitimacy. What is the state doing? How does it act? And what does it do? What is the capitalist state trying to do in terms of both promoting a productive economic regime, but also securing the social conditions for that regime to be taken as legitimate? I used to enjoy setting exam questions at Warwick about the functions of the capitalist state. The function of the capitalist state is to promote economic development of capitalism, discussed. Many years since I did those things. Secondly, relative autonomy. This means the relative autonomy of the labour process. I've often used this phrase, a semi-permeable membrane, which was instituted by Isabel Emmett and one of those many Morgans. This is David Morgan in 1982. And the idea is these external forces are moderated or shaped by the membrane, which then translates them or limits them in some way. So what are the formal and informal institutions that strengthen the membrane? In other words, allow relative autonomy within the point of production. On the other side of it, what are the processes that contain, shape, or even heighten the effects of those external forces? When I say heighten, what I'm thinking of here is examples I've come across, and I'm sure other people have as well, where actors in a workplace will use external forces to legitimise what they want to do anyway. That they will say, there's competition on the horizon. We must compete with the Chinese, and therefore we've got to do these things in the workplace. They use those external forces as part of their own rhetoric and rationale. Around all this, there are, of course, the three forms of power which agents can use in the workplace. I say there are three, and much taken by the work of the British social theorist, philosopher W.G. Runciman, who says there are these three and only three types of power, which are economic, political, but also ideological. So people use ideological power in terms of establishing a language and a regime of what's legitimate and what isn't legitimate. So workers may lack economic and political power, maybe they can use ideological and symbolic power. Then the use of these things practically, dynamics and agency I've called it. What are the elements of action? These turn in part on legacies and expectations from the past, the resources that people bring to a workplace in terms of what they believe is decent and right. Then there's a question of what conditions support that independent agency. And linked to that, what are the drivers in relation to dignity, decency and voice? And do those drivers exist? Are people aware of those sorts of issues? I struck recently, I came across a Gallup poll from the 1960s. And this reported women's experiences of discrimination. Now, we think of the 1960s as a period rife with discrimination. But at that time, only 19% of women questioned believed that discrimination existed in the labour market. And that's one illustration of the ways in which language and taken for granted assumptions exist, but also, of course, can be questioned. The ways in which gender equality have been promoted since the 1960s are, of course, notable. Now, I'm not saying here that we're talking, erecting any kind of simple model of false consciousness, namely that wherein workers aren't aware of their own interests. What I'm talking about is what we might reasonably expect workers to do and have interests in, and what allows or constrains the expression of those interests. Gregor mentioned the excellent journal, the Industrial Relations Journal, and I've got a paper in that journal recently which talks about all of that if you're interested in that theme. Now, methodologically, I was at Warwick back recently where I met former colleague and friend Tony Elgar. I always used to tease Tony that he'd start off his research project saying, it's all very complicated. And he'd come back from his field work and say, yep, it's very complicated. We don't have to do that. We can identify patterns and types. It's not endless variation. So if we can say what workplace regimes do have commonalities and similarities, we can understand what those things are, and then we can try and place them in some kind of typology, loose as it may be, and then we can say what kinds of workplaces are there. For example, how many are there with some sort of organised voice? We can map what they do, and then we can ask about the conditions for their existence. Finally, the benchmark. The benchmark is what can we reasonably expect? To start off with, slightly gnomic first bullet point there. My first visit to Quebec was when I organised a conference here with Larry and Jacques in 1991, where we were addressed, people there may remember, we were addressed by Willie Brown. And he said, all you people, you spend all your time saying it's all getting worse, you've got neo-Taylorism, it's all getting terrible. But actually, when you look at capitalism, it promoted economic growth and development. And in Marxist terms, you would say there is a development of the forces of production, and that has genuine social benefits. There is a tendency in capitalism for the forces of production to evolve, and we can do something with that. There is also the generation of new jobs and new opportunities. So the benchmark is, therefore, what might workers reasonably expect in terms of autonomy and voice? I think if we can establish some reasonable benchmark, it will help us measure what's happening. When we're talking about issues like how much autonomy and voice do people have, the obvious question is compared to what? And I think we need to ask, compared to what can we properly, reasonably expect in modernising industrial societies. And if we can establish that benchmark, that's the first thing. But then also we can establish what people themselves think their benchmark is. What do people themselves think and want? And if we can do that, we can begin to establish some measure of what's going on in relation to voice in the workplace, what's taken for granted, why is it taken for granted, and how can we improve that situation. So that's a large agenda for you all to work on, and when you've got the answer, I hope you'll publish it there. Je vous remercie de votre attention.